So I think we all should be on screen. This is here we are live from Normandy with another World War II TV extravaganza. We are in Normandy talking about the 7th Canadian Brigade on June the 8th and 9th and 10th, 1944. And we are going to have a lot of exciting times ahead of us. I'm so excited about what we're doing today. So joining me, my guests today are, and he was with us on Saturday for our big mammoth 15-hour extravaganza. We have Dr. Mike Bechtold. Hang on.
Hello, everybody.
Got a bit of double audio coming in there. So Mike Bechtold is joining us from Canada live. And we have our two roving reporters out there, Mag, who's my partner, and Duncan. And Mag is with a Normandy historian, Frederick Jan. That's Frederick in the bottom corner there, author and historian. And we are going to talk about these events. So without further ado, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, and then we're going to see about bringing Mike in and doing a bit more. So on June the 7th, the landings on June the 6th had been pretty successful. The Canadians had pushed fairly towards their objectives, but the line was quite mixed. It wasn't an even line. The morning of the 7th of June, the Canadian 9th Brigade start moving inland towards Carpiquet Airport, and that was fraught with problems because they bumped into elements of the 12th SS under Kurt Meyer, who was coming out of the Abbey d'Ardennes. It wasn't a total German victory. There were Canadian advances against the Germans, but it left the situation a little bit tricky that day because they hadn't gained their objectives. But by the latter stage of the 7th of June is where we're talking about today, and I'm going to bring Mike in now to explain about where the 7th Brigade were. They had been by the Assault Brigade on D-Day, along with the 8th, and the 9th Brigade had been in reserve. And I'm going to hand over to Mike for a little bit now to carry on the story.
Great, thanks, Paul. So the Canadian objective on D-Day on the 6th of June was supposed to be what they called the Oak Line, which was the highway or the rail line between Caen and Bayeux. And for a variety of reasons, they didn't get that far inland. The Canadians got further inland than any other Allied forces on D-Day, but they had to dig in on intermediate objectives. First thing in the morning on the 7th of June, they continued south to get to those spots. As Paul mentioned, the 9th Brigade had a tough time. They had an encounter battle with 12th SS. Generally, it's framed as a Canadian defeat and a 12th SS victory. I like to think of it at best a draw, and if you look at the accomplishments, it was really a Canadian victory because the Germans were stopped in their aim. They didn't really cause any serious damage to the Canadians in terms of the operational level of war, and the Canadians dug in and carried forward later. 7th Brigade, however, was able to carry on. There was only minimal resistance on their front. And the Winnipegs and the Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Regina Rifles advanced. They got into Brettville and Puto, dug in, and were ready. Now, the Canadians' main goal for the D-Day operations was to be a panzer-killing force. Planners going back months before D-Day had looked at the terrain of Normandy, and they realized that the terrain between Caen and Bayeux, especially astride the Mew River Valley, which is where 7th Brigade was the exact place where they would expect a German panzer counterattack to come. And as it turns out, that's exactly what the Germans were thinking. They had massed three powerful armored units, the Panzerlehr Division, the 12th SS Panzer, and 21st Panzer Division, which was in the Caen area. And they planned to launch a corps-level counterattack that was going to go through the Canadians all the way to Courseulles. And this offered a big danger to the Allies because it was kind of the center of their area. In fact, as Marc Milner points out, not only were the Canadians in the route of that attack, but also the headquarters of 1st British Corps, the headquarters of 2nd British Army, and Montgomery had established his headquarters, his advanced headquarters for 21st Army Group, just south of Caen as well. So if the Germans had succeeded, they would have really dashed a lot of Allied hopes. But we'll look at what happened.
So I'm going to bring in our first live cameraman, and we're going to turn to Mag and Fred, who are on the bridge over the highway just north of Puto en Bessin. So Fred, for our viewers, where are we? Can you give us our geography, please?
Paul,
Yes.
can you tell me the question, because we do not hear anything here?
Can you give us our geography, please?
That's your question.
Hello, Paul. Hello, Mike. We are standing on a bridge on National Road 13, which was a crossroad back in '44. And Puto en Bessin, the town stands right there. Puto is located between the National Road 13 and the railway tracks behind us, which was the Oak Line. And behind me, you can see the bridge where A Company Winnipeg Rifles reached on the 7th of June. You see the wind turbines, which is the 103. Next is the Breway Wood, and that was the junction between the Winnipeg Rifles and the 50 Division, British Division, and the 7th Battalion Green Howards and Winnipeg Rifles made the junction between Gold Beach and Juno Beach right there. And that's the initial objectives of the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade on the 6th of June, and they reached it on the 7th.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Mag. And apologies for the bad audio. The only way we can have Fred and Mag hear us is to have them microphones on. So there's a bit of wind interference there, but we hope you appreciate the fact this is live from the battlefield, to the minute almost of where some of these events happen. So what Fred was saying there is that the view south there, we can see across to point 103, which is where the British 50th Division were trying to push. This is just near the town of Tilly-sur-Seulles. And for those who've read about the British 50th Division, they had tough times there on point 103, bumping into Panzer 24th Lancers were there. Remember, we talked about them on Saturday on June the 6th with Alex Scott, whose family was with that regiment on D-Day. But we're here to talk about the 7th Brigade. And so back to Mike. And then while we're saying that, Fred and Mag are going to move to their second location. So Mike, let's pick up the story. And if you need me to put a map up, please tell me to do that.
Yeah, sure. Why don't we put map 1 up right now, and I can talk about the initial dispositions of the 7th Brigade. So both the Winnipegs and the Reginas had no problem getting up to the Oak Line. They had done a map recce of this in England, and they knew exactly where they were going. Foster Matheson, who was the commanding officer of the Reginas, elected to spread out his battalion. So he had 2 companies in Brettville itself. He had another company further to the east in Le Villeneuve, just south of Rowe. And probably his best idea, his most brilliant stroke, was that he put C Company south of the railway line in Nory-en-Bessin. And by that way, he was looking to control his sector more by fire than by having actual boots on the ground, which in the end was going to work out really well. The Winnipegs had a tougher goal, whereas the Regina's battlefield was very open and very easy to cover by fire. Puto itself was very closed in, and the Winnipegs were in a sense a victim of geography. Puto itself is a small straggling village, as it was described by some historians, built with stone buildings that made very good defensive positions, but were very poor to allow visibility for any defending troops. So Matheson, the Meldrum, the commanding officer of the Winnipegs, put 3 of his companies along the railway line, A Company by the road bridge over the rail line and an outlying part north of Bruay. C Company was in the center of the position, and D Company was furthest east. He put B Company and the headquarters north of the town, behind the town. You'll recall that B Company was the Winnipeg company that was hardest hit on D-Day. It had ended the day with only 26 men. They'd received reinforcements on the night of the 6th of June and some more on the 7th. So it was almost up to full strength, but it wasn't as cohesive as the other companies. So it was placed behind the village in a defending position. The 7th Brigade's task was should have been very easy, but it was seriously complicated by the fact that neither of the brigades on their flanks were able to make it up to the Oak Line as well. 9th Brigade, of course, was stopped by the counterattack of 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, so it had dug in quite further to the north in the area of Les Buissons. The 69th British Brigade, which was supposed to be on the right flank of the Winnipegs, had similarly not got up to the Oak Line, to the railway line at Bruay, and the 7th Battalion Green Howards had dug in at Saint-Croix-Grand-Tongue, which was about 5 kilometers behind where the Canadian position was. So what this meant on the ground was that both of those Canadian battalions in the front line had their flanks wide open. The Reginas had some consolation in that to their east was the Mew River Valley and Roe, which was a very difficult objective for anybody to go through. But the Canadians had that, or sorry, the Winnipegs had that right flank open that Jean was just showing us on the video. And it was just big, wide, open green fields that were very easy for the Germans to traverse.
Brilliant. So I'm just going to stop the screen share of that. So I think we're also going to bring in where the German positions are to give our second cameraman something to talk about as well. So I'm going to bring in Duncan, who's out in Roe. So this is the town of Roe, which you could see on the map we had a second ago. And this is the old N13 highway that runs between Bayeux and Caen. And this is going to be where one of the attacks we're going to talk about by the Germans begins on the 8th of June. We're doing this now because Duncan has to move on to another location for us shortly. So we're showing you some of these images now. I'm going to flash up some of these images, and those watching this, you'll be aware of some of these famous images. I'm going to put them up on the screen now for you. They were all taken about where we're standing. Duncan, can you show us the lane first, please? Where are you now? Yep, he's walking the lane now. So when he gets there and turns left into the lane, are you all watching this? This is the power of live television. Hold it there, Duncan. Bang. How about that, eh? This is exactly what we wanted to be. That's the exact location that was taken on the 8th of June, that photo. We'll bring in another one for you. There's plenty of these we can share with you. There's this one. There's back to the lane again. There is, I'm just bringing the next one in. This is all live, as you know. We're doing this while we're here. This next one, which way are you facing now? You're still in the lane, Duncan. So did we do this one? That wall there is the wall you can see on in Duncan's image behind you. Duncan, back to Duncan. That is the wall. I'll show you another one. Now, if you face round back to the street again, Duncan, can you do that? And do the view across the street. Right, now, can you see that building and with the garage and the gate? So have that in your mind. And then here is the image. Well, that's that gate there in the background. Are you enjoying it, those watching this? This is amazing stuff. We've got someone there live taking photos. And this is to set up who our foe are, really. And Mike will tell you more about these guys in a minute. We're just trying to get the idea of the fact that the Canadian 7th Brigade are fairly green. Well, they are, apart from D-Day and the 7th of June, they are absolutely green. And they are competing against the 12th SS, who are also pretty green, but they are, and we can discuss exactly how good they are as an enemy during the course of the day, but they are a formidable foe. I'll show you a couple more photos of the street there. So hang on, where we go. Which way are you going to, you're back in the lane again. Now, can you show the view back towards Caen now, Duncan? So back to where you live. You step out a bit now, hold it there. Now see that, for those watching it, see the creamy color wall in the background, in the middle there? Boom, there you go. How about that, eh? The wonders of technology. And then we will do another one. If you could do the view the other way, go towards Bayeux now, Duncan. Just got to find my right image. they've gone out of order in my little file here. Where's the image I'm trying to find? I cannot find the one I'm trying to find. It seems to have gone. There you go. Now, can you see the wall there in the original photo? See the diamond shapes in the brick wall there, and the SS Grenadiers there. Well, if you walk forward a bit, Duncan, can you see there are the exact same square holes in the brickwork there? Hold it there, Duncan. I'll put the image back on screen again, then we'll let Mike talk. This is just, we're just showing off now. I've got so confident on Saturday. I'm all confident with photos now. So that's why we're just showing you what we can achieve now with this amazing technology. And then, which photo haven't I shown yet? Row 8, that row number. Did we do that? We did that one. We did this one. I think we'll move it back to gallery view, and I'm gonna let Mike take us back. I think Mag and Fred are at our second location now, which is a rail bridge. I'll just show up a photo of. No, hang on, that's the next bridge. Do we need a second map now, Mike?
Yeah, we can go to map. Sorry, let me get myself organized. Map 2.
Map 2. So I'll show you the map first and point out where we are on this map, Mike. We are, if you see over Puto and Bessan, those watching this, we are on the bridge just under the word Bruay. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So that's where we are now, and I'll cut back to Frederick again to explain what we are. Mag is going to walk across. Can you start walking across the railway bridge, Mag? And just give us some geographical information. I'll bring Fred on in a minute, but Mike, I'll let you establish a bit more of the story here for us, please.
Yeah, so on the night of 7 June, the Winnipegs had some small counterattacks delivered at their position, nothing that ever threatened them. They also had a lot of patrols out in no man's land and came across Germans quite frequently. The Winnipeg's war diaries, interesting because they call them varmint patrols, trying to get rid of the varmints. And they were ready for anything that was going to happen. At that same time, the Reginas were defending against a relatively serious attack by 12th SS. The 1st Battalion of the 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment launched a major attack against the regiment overnight, and it was repulsed with heavy casualties on the German side. They attempted to break into Brettville, weren't able to, and had to retreat as dawn broke. As dawn was breaking on the Winnipeg's front, that's when the 2nd Battalion of 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment started to make its move against Puto. And it started quite small, about 6:30 in the morning. The first attacks were going in, artillery started to meet the positions, and the Canadians had no trouble pushing off the German attacks. However, as the morning went on, the Germans were able to bring in more artillery and most importantly, began infiltrating into the Canadian positions. And if we can get Meg to look to, I guess, her left to look down the railway line.
Can you hear that, Mag? Look to your left. Down the railway. Oh, hang on, I'll message her as well. The problem is the audio is very bad for Mag to hear me with the wind. So I'm messaging her. There we go.
There we go.
We've got it. Fantastic. So, thank you.
So the geography of this position is really important. And you can see that it's a very deep railway cutting here. It's probably 15 feet deep, something like that. And it's very much like it was in 1944. So the town of Puto was protected against a direct Panzer assault, but these cuttings were nothing that could stop the Panzer Grenadiers from infiltrating. So you can just barely see off in the distance at the extreme eastern end of Puto is where D Company was, and there things open up quite a bit. The railway cutting goes to pretty much ground level, and the D Company has really good fields of fire. The SS weren't able to penetrate at all in front of D Company, and in fact, D Company stayed there and weren't overrun during the entire battle. However, you can see this territory is very different for A and C companies, which were along this stretch, both in front of where Meg is looking and behind towards Rouet, and the Canadians didn't have good lines of sight, so they couldn't see the Germans. And as they were forced to sort of cover their heads as the artillery was coming in, the Germans infiltrated. So by 10 o'clock, things were getting very hot. Colonel Meldrum was going around the entire battle, reinforcing his men, encouraging them, making sure reserves got to where they were needed. By about 12:30, the German fire became so intense that Meldrum couldn't get around the battlefield on foot anymore, and he hopped in one of his FU tanks. The forward observation officer had a Sherman tank with a dummy gun, and he was still able to get around. But as the afternoon progressed, it became very clear that A and C companies had been overrun completely, and B company, which was behind the town, was also directly threatened. It wasn't physically overrun, but it was overrun by fire. It couldn't get out of there because it was too exposed to do that. The Germans were very successful at going around the right flank of the Canadians. So I'm not quite sure if they went across the railway bridge or if they just infiltrated west of the railway bridge, but they had quite a sizable force that was going around Puto to the right, to the west, and was threatening to completely encircle the regiment. And this is where Foster Matheson's plan came into effect. Matheson was the commander of 7th Brigade, and he had realized that the British hadn't advanced forward to the Oak Line, and that the Winnipegs had this big wide open flank. So there's a small wood just behind Puto near a place called La Bergerie Farm, and he put a very strong little battle group in there. It had a company of Canadian Scottish Infantry, D Company. There was 2 troops of towed anti-tank guns, 4 17-pounders from the 62nd British Anti-Tank Regiment, and 4 towed 6-pounders from the 3rd Canadian Anti-Tank Regiment. And there was also 2 platoons from the Camerons of Ottawa, 1 platoon of medium machine guns and another platoon of 4.2-inch mortars. And this position was absolutely crucial to the battle, and probably saved the day, because from that position, they were able to control by fire that entire open flank of the Winnipegs. And just as the Germans were coming around, the war diary of, I forget if it was the Canadian Scottish or 62nd Anti-Tank Regiment, records that there was something in the neighborhood of about 9 to 10 tanks that were trying to outflank the Winnipegs, and they were promptly engaged, and 62nd Anti-Tank thinks they knocked out between 4 and 6 of those tanks. Now, the whole question of tanks is a bit of a controversial one, because there's a number of historians who have written that said there were no tanks in this battle. Hubert Meyer, who was the chief of staff of 12th SS Hitler Youth Division, wrote a book after the war, and he claims the Hitler Youth had no tanks in the battle. And this is a claim that's been repeated by a number of historians, including John English, who wrote a book called The Canadians in Normandy. And he says that the Winnipegs were put to flight, that there were no tanks. The Winnipegs war diary says very clearly that they were outnumbered 2 to 1 in infantry, and English says that was balderdash. 12th SS only had 3 companies there, and he's basing all this on Hubert Meyer's book. And it's very clear from my research and the work of other historians that there was quite a bigger, stronger force of Germans that were attacking. There was, in addition to the entire 2nd Battalion of 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, there 4 companies were there, and these were 4 strong companies. There were elements of Panzerlehr Division that were involved in the battle. There were elements of 1st Battalion, 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment that was involved in the battle, and they had quite a lot of artillery. So the Canadians, the Winnipegs, were definitely outnumbered and overrun, and there were certainly tanks. Now, maybe they weren't tanks proper, as in Mark IVs or Panther tanks, but they were likely assault guns, Stug 3s or something like that, armored fighting vehicles. And as far as the infantry was concerned, a tank is a tank is a tank. They're not going to get into debates about whether it had a turret that moved or anything like that. They know it's big, it's loud, it's armored, and it's got a nasty gun and machine guns that are difficult to deal with. So for them, a tank is anything that comes at them on tracks.
So I think shall we have Fred give us a little bit of geography for a second, just as he's the man on the ground. We'll have Fred come in.
Standing next to the bridge on the western part of the town of Puto, which was the A Company Winnipeg Rifles, commanded by Major Fred Hodge. So they held that position. C Company was in the town, right there, and D was on the railway tracks as well, but on the other side of the town, next to Brettville and the Cardonville farm. B Company was located on the big farm, right there. And thing is, when the Germans attacked on the very first flight on the 8th of June, they tried to cross the railway tracks, but Winnipeg Rifles they put them they stopped the attack many times, and the German understood one thing. In Brigade, the railway tracks is on the ground level, and some unit of the Panzer Lair plus some unit of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Panzer Regiment, attacked on that plain, which was quite easy to drive for the all the aft tracks and German vehicles. And thing is, the junction I told you about next to on Brigade Bridge, the Brigade Wood, sorry, was something like a half-mile away, and the German used that gap, and they flanked the Winnipeg Rifles on their right flank, and they reached the highway where we were just standing on the bridge, which was the crossroad, and they attacked the village and took the railway tracks. C Company was in very bad shape as well. A Company was almost all soldiers were captured, and B Company as well. So Lieutenant Colonel Meldrum and what was remaining of the D Company on the other bridge, they were retreating inside the town, and they were waiting for the Canadian skies to counterattack by the night of the 8th to the 9th of June.
Well, thank you. That's enough, I think, Fred, for that. And for those watching, we are in an amazing position where we have two, not rival historians, but they both want to tell the same story in their own different ways. Mike has been studying it from the Canadian point of view with the archives. Fred has been on the ground. He was born in Rowe, where Duncan was earlier, and he's been writing about this. His book, Hold the Oak Line, I'll tell you all about it later on, and we'll show images of it. So, you know, we've got two of the absolute premier historians who know their stuff about the 7th Brigade here. And Fred has even got archives he has recovered, artifacts he's picked up. He's got some stuff there in this battlefield here, which is just extraordinary. So there's the book there, and
yeah,
he's got bits of
some items. That's some items we found on that very spot. They all belong to A Company Winnipeg Rifles, and we found the canteen. You can see the shrapnel that went through. Same thing for that canteen. The nesting is damaged. That one as well, and that's what was left of a mug. We also find a Canadian Scottish cap badge, Winnipeg Rifles cap badge. You can see it was a small shrapnel that went through the badge. Some bayonets, a compass, and two what we call a commando dagger. And the Canadian were issued that dagger right before D-Day, and took that one as well, which is a 50 cal shell. You can see one bullet went through it. And some more artifacts like a canteen as well. So they were found in the Canadian foxholes a few years ago. And we found a lot of the cases and guns, and everything was smashed and destroyed. Helmets as well. And you know, it's those relics speaks for themselves. I mean, if you see that, you see the shrapnel going inside of it. It's just have to imagine what was the Battle of Puto. It was very brutal, very violent. So and the Canadian, they lost so many soldiers there. So that's moving items, moving historical items.
Well, thank you, Fred. I'm going to cut back to Mike again now. This is extraordinary stuff. And for those watching us, can you realize how unique this is? We've got someone on the battlefield showing you relics from the actual fields where this story occurred. You've got Mike coming back in to talk about it from the Canadian point of view. This is absolutely extraordinary, this stuff. I'm enjoying it, and I hope you are too. So we'll bring Mike back in now. I honestly, I forgot where we got with the with the story now, Mike. But hopefully you remember.
It's all good. It's all good. The story that Fred is telling is absolutely remarkable, and the fact that he's there on the ground and has the artifacts that have been recovered from the battlefield is so important to the story, because we can never forget the individuals involved. And this was a terrible battle for the Winnipegs. They had about 100 and, should I get my numbers right, 105 men killed in this battle. And roughly half of those were men that had been captured by the 12th SS, taken behind the battlefield, disarmed, interrogated in some cases, and then executed, which is a really terrible footnote to this story. Overall, the Winnipeg suffered about 256 casualties in this battle, 50 killed during the battle, about 150 total were taken prisoner. So it was really a terrible toll. I know that Pat Weston is watching today, and Pat's uncle was one of the men involved in this battle. Bill Cybalski was in C Company, and while we don't know his exact story, we're pretty sure that he was one of the guys that was overrun and died defending Puto. And it's just bringing a name and a face to this terrible battle. It's really important to say that the Winnipegs never broke or ran at any point during this engagement. Jack English kind of insinuates that the Winnipegs had broken run, and that's absolutely not the case. They were certainly overrun. They certainly had to go to ground, but they held on and fought to the bitter end in every case. And the importance of this can't be overestimated because of what happened in the next phase of this battle. And if we can go to the next map, would be map 6 on your list. The second phase of the Puto battle was one of the most remarkable that took place, because while the Winnipegs were holding on, Harry Foster, the brigadier, was trying to figure out what to do. And if the Winnipegs had broken and ran, he would have had to leave the Canadian Scottish, which were holding a reserve position in Sackville, as sort of the next line of defense. But because the Winnipegs held on, he was free to organize a counterattack to regain Puto. And Fred Cabeldew, the commander of the Canadian Scottish, was given the warning order at 8:30 in the evening. We're coming up very close to that. Sorry, he was given the warning order at 6:30. And 2 hours later, he had organized his men, come up with a plan, coordinated with the artillery, coordinated with the other arms that were supporting him. And he had support from the 1st Hussars and from a troop of 17-pounder M10s from 62nd Anti-Tank Regiment. And he launched a counterattack behind a rolling artillery barrage. His B company had been on the far left flank, guarding against any infiltrations across the Mew River Valley. They went on about an 8-kilometer forced march cross country and arrived just at the time the rest of the battalion was in Roll. And in less than 2 hours, they captured Puto. I would argue that they put 12th SS to flight. That 12th SS panicked and ran, and eventually abandoned Puto. And by about 10:30 that night, on the 8th of June, Puto was back in Canadian hands, and the Canadians wouldn't lose it for the rest of the war. The Germans would never get back in there again.
And Mike, should we send them on to the second bridge now?
Yeah, for sure.
So Matt, Mag and Fred, you can move on to the second bridge. I'll send them a message as well, so they are completely clear. Remember, they can't hear very well because of the wind. So if this is appearing to be not completely professional, we're dealing with lots of moving parts here. But this is just incredible. I'm enjoying it so much. So they should be on their way to the next bridge now. And when they go off down the route there, we will have the camera filming while they're driving. And Michael mentioned it, as I will, but you'll see when they get into the village of Puto how small and narrow the streets are, with these very imposing stone walls. There's no cover, And as Mike said earlier on, it's sort of a stretched out village there, and you'll see all that. And we've still got footage coming from Duncan in Row. We'll come back to Duncan later on for another story. So they're going, Mag and Fred, through the open fields now. I'll bring that up on full view there. And you can see at the moment, it's still the open wheat fields and not really the hedgerow country you think of when you think of some of Normandy. But when you see them get into the town, you'll see it all gets very condensed and restricted. Obviously, some of these towns now are bigger than they were in the war. So the first couple of houses often are the modern ones. And then you drive another 100 or 2 yards and you get into the old part of town. And I'm sure Mike can give us some stories of what happened in Puto. And we're going to come later on when we get towards the end of this show, we're going to stop at the actual memorial to those who fought in Puto, a wonderful monument that I must say, he'd be too humble to mention it himself. Frederick Jan, our on-the-spot historian, was involved in getting this memorial done. But look at these narrow streets we're coming into now. Do you want to add some comments to this, Mike?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that at the start of the battle, none of the Winnipegs were actually in Puto itself. They were all situated along the railway line because, as you can see, this is a very closed-in town, and you've got no fields of fire. You don't have any ability to defend yourself. As the Germans infiltrated, the Canadians fell back into Puto, and some of them went to ground in the buildings here. But most of the fighting was taking place around the peripheries of the village, and it was a good decision by Meldrum not to have his men stationed in the town. While it might have been safer for them, those big stone buildings offer a lot of protection against artillery and small arms fire. There was no ability to defend the town by being in it. And in fact, Cavaldu, once he recaptured the town and took it over, they held the town for the night of the 8th of June, and there was a number of German attempts to get back in, but they all failed. But the next morning he reevaluated and he realized that this really wasn't a position that was conducive to the defensive. So he pulled all his companies out of Puto back about 50 to 100 yards so that he could reestablish his fields of fire, brought his FOOs forward, his forward observation officers, and had artillery there to basically do all the killing of the Germans should they come back again.
And this is the center part of town here, and you can see how high these walls are. And for those who haven't been to Normandy, these walls may be 200, 300, even 400 years old. And the area we're going to be stopping at later is on our right now. But I know it's a bit choppy, the footage. We're getting some comments coming in. It's the bandwidth. We've got 4 feeds coming in. We're doing our very best, but there's a monument there. And when we get towards the end of the show, Mag and Fred will stop there, and we can get a good clear view of the inscriptions on the monument there. And I want to again just emphasize how privileged we are to have Frederick with us and Mike. I mean, it is the dream team in terms of talking about this battle here. And Frederick knows this area like the back of his hand. Mike knows it as well, but Fred was born in this village, so I think he has a slight advantage over that in just that he grew up here. These are the very fields and streets he ran around with in as a kid. And Mike, coming over from Canada, frequently, but can't get this behind the scenes access that someone like Fred can have. So we're very privileged to have Fred doing the on the ground stuff, and of course equally privileged to have Mike doing the main narrative for this. And I'm just here to control it all and be the studio producer, really. But Mike, I'll let you carry on. They're going to be getting their second stop soon, and then we've had some requests to go back and show those photos of the SS in Row clearly. And I should have made it clear at the time, when we come to bring that story in, we will show you those photos again, because that's where an attack that Mike will tell us about commenced about this time of day on the 8th of June, in fact. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And we're going down a track to another railway bridge. And while we're driving, I'll just show a photo of the bridge as it was at the time. So this is, the thing is that the railway line has changed a bit now. Some of the bridges that went over the railway line now go under. Some of the ones at crossroads are now bridges. So the crossing points remain in a similar place, but sometimes the actual means of crossing or passing under the railway line have changed. But this is the kind of thing where this is one of Frederick's photo. All these photos of Frederick's incredible book, Hold the Oak Line, which I will reference for you later. But they're just about coming up this other railway bridge. And while we're driving, as the local guy as well, look at the open wheat fields. We've had a couple of comments, people saying how this is not how they imagine Normandy to be. It's not the hedgerows you see in Saint-Mary-Glise and places like this. Is open wheat fields. Remember, folks, this is June the 8th. The crops would have been at the same height. In fact, these are beans. We were here this morning doing a recce. It's actually beans growing here, but very flat. And when they get out of the car, Mag, can you show us across towards Caen? Show us the hospital in Caen. When you're traveling through Normandy, you want to reference where the city of Caen is. It's very easy to do because there's a massive 19-floor hospital building called the CHU, the SHU. And if Mag holds the camera there, can you zoom in a little bit, Mag? You just zoom a little bit on the horizon there. I hope those watching you can see that, but there is this building right on the distance. Well, that is the SHU building in Caen, showing us that we're looking east at that point. So Juno Beach is off to the left of the camera, and then they will show you the bridge in a minute. In fact, I'll just cut to Fred to give us the geographical information. Then I'll come back to Mike again. So
the Eastern Bridge, where D Company Major Fulton was. In the middle of that field, there was a quarry, which also had a kind of a wood next to it, and that's the position D Company and Major Fulton, who was a very good and clever officer, who took command of the Winnipeg Rifles in October '44. He repelled all the SS attacks on the 8th of June. The SS never crossed the railway tracks right there, and they have a very good point of view and very good line of fires as well. And to show you how close that battlefield is, you can see the Brettville steeple right there, and the two cranes and the white factory right there. That's next to Cardonville Farm, where D Company Regiment Rifle Captain Gordon Brown was on the night of the 8th to the 9th of June. So that's the part where the Winnipeg Rifles were not surrounded by the SS.
Thank you, Fred. We'll cut back to Mike now. Brilliant stuff. This is Mag. Show us the bridge, and I'll cut back to Mike to explain exactly what was happening, or go into a bit more detail about what was happening here. Fred gave us some groundwork there, but Mike, tell us more about the location.
Yeah, so like Fred had said, this is the area that D Company was defending, and the experience of D Company was quite unlike the rest of the battalion in that they had really good open fields of fire here. They had lots of visibility, and every German attempt to winkle them out was defeated. And D Company was not overrun. As the rest of the battalion was overrun, D Company was ordered to pull back. They pulled back in good order and formed a new defensive perimeter, basically behind the town where the battalion headquarters had been, and continued to defend the whole time. And they stayed there until they were relieved by the counterattack of the Canadian Scottish and the 1st Hussars on the evening of the 8th of June. There's a great story of Company Sergeant Major Belton, who was flitting about the battlefield in a universal carrier, a Bren gun carrier, taking ammunition to his men and stuff like that. He was with B Company, and towards the end of the battle, he was ordered to go back to 7th Brigade headquarters in Sackville. And so he tried to scoot out of town, and at one point he came across two German, he's not sure if they're tanks or assault guns, but they were on either side of the road that he was going along. And he said he came upon them so quickly that they didn't have time to react, and he was through their position and over the ridge out of sight before they were able to bring their guns to bear on him. So that's the kind of close quarters battle that we're talking about here.
And again, I'll just reference again how open. So we're looking more or less south now. So that's off almost in the direction of Villers-Bocage to the right round there, which we're going to be doing another special on June the 13th. So for those watching it who want to hear about the action, the infamous action with Michael Wittmann, we have Daniel Taylor, hopefully, who wrote Villers-Bocage Through the Lens on, talking about that. And I also should point out on June the 10th, so a couple of days time, we're doing another live stream, weather permitting. It's looking really bad for Wednesday, but that'll be from Purple Heart Lane in Carenton, of the 502nd attacking Carenton. So I'm intending to bring you these every 2 or 3 days for as long as I can keep on going, really. But gorgeous sunshine there. It was overcast today. It's fantastic. Remember, folks, we are live to the day, almost to the hour where some of these actions are happening. When we cut back to Duncan in Row soon, and we talk about another attack that Mike will go into some extraordinary detail on, we are only about an hour and a half ahead of when these events happened 76 years ago today. So this is what we're trying to do here, bring you something unique. This is, we believe, rather groundbreaking stuff here we're doing.
Yeah,
Mike, sorry, I'll hand over to you again.
Yeah, no problem. I was going to make a couple points. Keep in mind that I'm not sure what time it gets dark there, but it's around 10:30 this time of year. Is that?
That's about right, yeah.
That's about right. So when the Canadian Scottish kicked off their attack at 8:30, it would have been maybe a little dimmer than it is right now, but it was still daylight hours. It's not getting dark yet. The other part has to do with the open fields, and especially when you compare it to the bocage the Americans were fighting through in their sector. These open fields that are in this area, and especially south of Caen on the Caen-Falaise Road, are often referred to by people as good tank country, in that it's open fields, easy for deployment. I like to point out that good tank country is generally even better anti-tank country, and that the Germans, with not just their Panther tanks and some Tigers, but also all of their towed artillery, the 88 millimeter, the 75 millimeter, and everything like that, can easily target and destroy Sherman tanks from 1,000, 1,500, even 2,000 yards away. So these big open fields are really good for the defender. And one thing this battle shows is that attacking in Normandy is a very difficult maneuver, that the British, the Canadians, the Americans often get criticized for the trouble they have in attacking. Well, here we can see the Germans attacking and having the exact same kind of problems, because the army on the defensive, who's had time to dig in, has time to sight their guns, has time to come up with an artillery plan, is always going to be at the advantage. And while it is possible to attack and it's possible to have success in the attack, it's always going to come at a very steep cost.
And it's worth referencing for those watching on Saturday, and it's all still there, well, apart from the last 3 hours of the 15 hours Mammoth broadcast, as James Holland always makes the point, it's this big war that we may lose some Sherman tanks along the way against the Germans, but we can replace our Sherman tanks, we can replace our artillery, we can replace our men. Even the Germans, if we knock out a Panther, if we knock out a Mark IV, the Germans have no replacements for that. So they are bashing themselves into destruction against our forces. It's been a negative way of looking at it. The Canadian or historians back in the 60s and 70s, the British, were always saying how efficient the Germans were and how not very efficient we were. And I think we're looking at it the other way now. Every time we are engaging the Germans, we are blunting the edge of their sword. And when we talk about the Panther actions later on, their Germans are losing the vehicles they cannot replace. So extraordinary stuff now. And we're going to cut back to Duncan in Row fairly shortly and have Mag and Fred move on to their next point. Mike, what more have we got to say at this location? Are we coming towards the next sequence now? More to say here?
No, I think the story of the Winnipegs is pretty much finished here. I'm just going to reiterate the fact that the Winnipeg's stand in Puto was absolutely miraculous, in terms of the fact that they were overrun by a stronger force that had strong artillery and armored support, whether it's tanks or AFBs, it really doesn't matter. The fact is that the Winnipegs held on and continued fighting the entire time. Nobody broke, nobody ran, nobody gave up. And the fact that they kept fighting the whole time made the fact that the Canadian-Scottish counterattack could be mounted possible. If at any point the Winnipegs had broken and ran, this battle would have been a totally different story.
Absolutely incredible words there, and very important to remember. And I'm glad again that we're part of a movement to pat ourselves on the back, both the Canadians and the British, for doing a very good job here. It's not always been considered that way. There's a lot of negativity about the performance of the Canadians and the British, and we're going to talk about the 12th SS in a minute. And I called this live stream the 7th Brigade against the 12th SS. Well, that was to kind of bring you all in and hook you in. Of course, it was only elements of the 12th SS. The 12th SS are spread out over quite a large area. They're engaging the 3rd British Division over towards Caen. So it's elements of the 12th SS, and we'll discuss exactly what kind of unit they are, because they are variously described in books as being an elite unit, and they're certainly more efficient than a lot of German units number. The average age is fairly young. These are most of the class of 1926, 1927. They're 18 and 19. They've got up-to-date vehicles, but are they really elite, or do they think they're elite? That's the thing. These are mostly fairly fanatical Nazis, and they tend to perform quite well when things are going well for them, and then when things start unraveling, they crumble, I think, quite fast. I think that Mike would agree with me on that. Whereas the Canadians, the British, maybe don't crumble quite as fast as the SS do, and it's their youth. I think it's their youth that works against them. But we'll cut back to Duncan now, and we had some requests to show those photos of the SS there, and if Mike wants to comment about some of the Germans in those units. And I was talking to Fred on our recce today. A lot of the photos we're going to show you in a minute are described as being taken after the battle we're going to talk about next. Well, that they were all taken before the battle. There's lots of rather poor history saying that there was a Panther officer whose head was decapitated and they're cleaning blood out of the tank. Well, it can't have been, because the photos were taken before the battle, not after. But Mag and Fred are making their way to their final stop, the memorial. I'll put Duncan back up on full screen, and then we'll bring up these photos again to show you where. So Duncan, hold that view there, Duncan, and I'll share the screen again of what we're looking at. So see the garage in the background there. So that is the same location. Mike, if you want to start talking about these photos as I show them and what was happening. We're moving now to the eastern side of our story, to the town of Roe, and an attack towards Brettville-Lourgueilleuse. And I'll hand over to Mike, and I'll keep sharing these photos.
Yeah, so your words about 12th SS are very good in that it was considered an elite division. It was filled with Hitler youth, basically young boys who had grown up on the Nazi pablum. They were mostly born in 1926, so they were quite young, 18 years old. This was their first battle. They were very well trained. They were very indoctrinated. They believed Hitler. He was their god. They would do anything for him. And the NCOs and officers that commanded them were pretty much all combat veterans who had experience in the Battle of France 1940, and especially on the Eastern Front. And they had the best of weapons. They were at full complement. A lot of German divisions were lacking in weapons, in up-to-date tanks. They'd been given handoffs from the British or the French or Czechs or whatever. But the 12th SS was a very powerfully armed division. They also had a very strong feeling that they were elite, that they were the best. And Kurt Meyer, who was the commander of 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, would later go on to command the division itself when Witt, the divisional commander, was killed a few days after D-Day. Also felt that the British and the Canadians weren't very good opponents. He famously said early on that we will throw the little fish back into the sea when he was told about the invasion. And as it turned out, these little fish had some pretty damn big teeth. He also thought that the Canadians and the British were going to react like the Soviets did, and that all you had to do was shock them. And if you didn't kill them all, they were going to break and run. So the next attack that we're going to look at, which took place on Brettville on the late evening of the 8th of June and continued into the night, he thought that all he had to do was send his Panther tanks at the Canadians, and like the Russians before them, as soon as they were confronted by the tanks, they would break and run and leave the Germans in control of the town. And as it turned out, things were very different, and he was going to find out that he'd bitten off more than he could chew.
I think I want to add that we shall throw those little fishes back in the sea. I don't know that's ever been really well translated into English. I read it more as like pond life, as scum. I think fishes isn't quite as offensive as Meyer is meaning it. My interpretation. I think he's almost, it's a slur. It's not just a little fishes. There's almost like a racial slur behind it, I think. And I don't know little fishes is really an accurate way of describing it. What's your feeling on that, Mike?
I'm really interested to hear that. I've only seen it written in, first time I saw it was, I forget the guy's name. He was a Canadian officer during the war, had interviewed Meyer and had it in his history. I can dig that out for anybody who's interested. So I'd never heard of any different context between the original German, but it wouldn't surprise me. He was very contemptuous of the Canadians and the British, and thought they weren't his equal as soldiers.
And as you so rightly say, he was proved to be somewhat wrong with his opinion there. But again, I'm holding these photos on the screen longer than last time. And then in a few moments, Duncan is going to drive this attack kind of in real time. And Mike will give us some comments. We had a comment from someone watching, Sean, that we haven't mentioned the name support very much. So maybe, Mike, if you want to add a couple of words about that. Obviously, in these live streams, we can't mention absolutely everything. But yeah, Mike, that was a comment we had.
Sorry, I missed that. It kind of...
We didn't mention the naval support for some of the 7th Brigade.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can broaden that out to talk about artillery support in general. When we're looking at these battles, we get focused on the infantry and the tanks that are supporting them, but artillery was probably the key to winning this battle. The Allies had such a wealth of artillery. The Winnipegs had 12th Field Regiment that was assigned to directly support them, so 24 25 pounders. 13th Field Regiment was supporting the Reginas, and they had not just the guns of each other, but all the guns of the Canadian and British forces that were in the bridgehead that could be called down to fire at any one time. So it could be a regimental target, it could be a divisional target, it could be a corps target, or they could call down every single gun within range very quickly. So that's a huge advantage. For the naval bombardment, they're starting to get out of range of most of the ships at sea at this point. For the 9 Brigade advance on the 7th of June, they had a what's known as a FOB, forward officer bombardment, a naval officer, their equivalent of a FOO, who was with them. And unfortunately, his radio was on the fritz when the Kurt Meyer attack first hit. And for some reason, the guns of 14th Field Regiment weren't ready to support either. So the only 2 hours that Meyer had any success against 9th Brigade was when the Canadians had no umbrella of artillery support. As soon as the naval guns and artillery got back online, at that point, it was nothing but Canadian success from that point on. And it's the same with the 7th Brigade battle. They had a lot of artillery resources during the entire battle that they could call down. And there's at least a couple of attacks that the 12th SS make that are made in almost battalion strength on the Reginas that the Reginas almost don't notice. They see something happening, they call down artillery, and the attack doesn't even make it into their war diary because it was almost completely obliterated by the artillery support, when in reality it was a major battalion level attack that had been squashed by the artillery.
So what we're going to do now, this is the exciting part of the presentation, is Duncan is now going to drive in real time. Well, Valerie, his other half, is going to drive in real time while Duncan is videoing. And I can only apologize for the patchy coverage there. It's because of the bandwidth in Normandy and connecting 4 phones and streams to this. But the point is, we're doing this not quite to the hour. This was happening a bit later that evening, as Mike said earlier. But we're now going to drive east on the old N13 highway. If we're in Normandy now, the modern N13 highway is a little bit south of this road. This runs from the Cora supermarket eastwards. And Mike will tell us what was happening and who was doing this attack and what they were heading towards the town of Brettville, Lourdes. So Duncan, I think, is actually filming out the window. I think that's his, he said he wasn't going to do that, but he is. So Mike, pick up the story for us, please.
Yeah, so about 2200 hours, 10 o'clock that night, about the same time the Canadian Scottish have completed the recapture of Puto, Kurt Meyer is launching his attack on Brettville. And he's got his 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment in the Mew River Valley in the area of Roe. And he decides that he's going to take 2 companies of Panther tanks, the 1st and the 4th Panther companies, and he's going to launch them down the main Con Bayeux Highway right at Brettville. He's supported by a strong force of infantry and a fair number of artillery, including some self-propelled artillery guns. So he's got a very strong force, and he's also anticipating an attack from the south, from Saint-Mandeville, where the 1st Battalion of the 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment is, to be joining that attack. So he kicks off the attack. Remember, it's still light out, and the Canadians immediately see that. They immediately call down artillery fire on the Panthers, and they're not able to stop the tanks, but they do strip them of their artillery, of all their infantry. So the infantry all have to get off the Panther tanks. They have to go to ground to protect themselves from the artillery fire. And Meyer's Panthers continue on alone. And anybody who knows anything about armored attacks know that armor in an urban environment is really not a good idea, because infantry can hole up in the buildings, they can hide, they can get out of the line of fire of both the main armaments and the machine guns, and there's not a lot the tanks can do. And that's exactly the situation that Meyer found himself at. He put one company of tanks directly into Brettville. He sent another one to the south at Cardenville Farm. And while they both companies got to their objectives, they weren't able to accomplish anything. The company in Brettville itself started firing at suspected Canadian positions, but the Canadians, rather than breaking and running like they would have expected them to based on the Russian example, just went to ground, and they called in artillery right on their position. And as it got dark, the Panthers found they couldn't do anything. The Canadians sent out tank killing teams with the Piat, and the Piat is a really quite a marvelous weapon. It's a projector infantry anti-tank, and it's properly a spigot mortar. Not a rocket propelled round like the American bazooka or the German Panzerfaust, but it fires its round on a big spring. So the advantage of that is that while it had a relatively short range, it didn't leave any kind of blast, so it could be fired from cover and not necessarily expose where the team was that was firing it. So the Canadians sent out these teams to hunt the Panthers and knock them out, and got quite a number of them. And there's quite a famous photo of a Panther tank sitting on the main street in Brettville.
We're getting to that soon, Mike. Don't spoil. They give the ending away quite yet.
I'm sure we're going to see it.
We are. And I just want to add a little bit about, as Mike was saying, about the armor there. As a kid, I remember Donald Sutherland in Kelly's Heroes explaining that the Tiger tank is an open country tank, and the same applies to the Panther. Long barrel, great for killing at long range, not so good in the confines of a town. Even just rotating the turret takes a lot longer in a Panther, and if the battery is not charged enough, you have to hand crank it. The Sherman had advantage in that. And so the Panthers, bringing them in to the same kind of narrow streets you would have seen earlier in Puto and Bessin, the Brettville-Lourgueille's town is much more suited to that kind of combat. And I'm showing a couple of images now of the Regina rifles dug in the Brettville Lourgueille's area, and they'd had a day to get ready. They'd been there since the morning of the 7th, and they've had time. See how that rifleman there has created a loophole in the wall there. So they've got some potentially good ambush positions, and the success that Meyer had the day before in Oti and Buron against the 9th Brigade was because he caught the Canadians moving towards him in the open. The situation has been essentially reversed now. The Canadians are dug in. They have the better ground. They have mortars dug in. They have their loopholes ready. And the SS, perhaps arrogant, there's some suggestions that the night of the 7th of June, after their victories in Oti, they're getting a bit drunk. They're possibly using drugs. That was a revelation some historians have been working at the last couple of years. And this attack, Mike will confirm, was delayed repeatedly from the German point of view during the 8th. They wanted to get it started earlier, but there were various problems. In fact, some of them may have even been just taking these PR photos I showed you. The Germans were actually stopping to take photos because they expected, and I hope Mike will nod while I'm saying this, they were expecting a pretty easy victory in this town. They'd had some real success the day before, and as you'll find out shortly, it wasn't quite to be. But Duncan now should be, he's now in Brettville-Lourgueille's. So now hold that shot. When you just get a bit further up, Duncan, And then when you are maybe by that third or fourth post, I want you to just stop and hold the camera, showing us towards Caen, showing us to the east. So Duncan, about now, stop. Now hold that image there, and I'll let Mike carry on the story. And I'm going to show you the wartime image of coming down that road. I'm just going to find the right image. This is all, as you know, doing all this live. So where is the image I'm looking for? It is somewhere around here. It's the one behind me, in fact. But here, just go back slightly, Duncan, so we can see the edge of the house. So look at the house on the left there, the creamy color one. Duncan is now taking photography and walking backwards. He's a former Scots guardsman, so this is challenging his multi-task. Right, hold it there, Duncan. And then Mike, tell the story of the first Panther coming down the road. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit bossy now, and then I'll show the photo. So over to Mike now.
Yeah, no problem. I think the best way to do this is to read the passage in the that was written by Colonel Matheson. And he said that at midnight, 2 Panthers entered the town. One came opposite battalion headquarters and was struck by a Piat bomb fired from behind a stone wall at 15 yards range, safe from the tank's huge gun. It halted for a moment, started again, and after 30 yards, it was hit again by a second Piat. It stopped, turned around, and headed out of town. A third Piat finished it off so that it slewed around out of control, running over a necklace of 75 grenades, which blew off a track. The crew dismounted and attempted to make off, but were killed by small arms fire. During this incident, the second Panther had remained further up the road. Seeing the fate of its companion, it commenced to fire both 75mm and machine gun wildly down the street like, quote, a child in a tantrum, doing no damage whatsoever except to set fire to the first Panther. So those photos are some of the most remarkable now and then that we can look at, and that Panther tank is featured in virtually any book you see about the Canadians in Normandy or Normandy in general. It's sitting there as a sort of a trophy of the Reginas, showing just how ineffective the 12th SS attack was on that night. Here was what's often considered one of the most powerful tanks of the Second World War, and it's been humbled by the Green Infantry of the Regina Rifles, who weren't daunted by those attacks, who just dug in, fell back on their training, and used the tools they had at their disposal to knock them out. And the Germans weren't able to accomplish anything. Finally, as dawn was breaking, Meyer was forced to concede that he had failed miserably, and he called all his tanks out of the town and left the Reginas in complete control of the village.
So hopefully you're enjoying this incredible opportunity to see these locations almost a minute of where this action took place. So if you show the view the other way now, Duncan, turn around and face towards Bayer. He's very obedient, isn't he? Isn't he good? Right, now, hold that shot there, Duncan. See the railings on the left. See the church tower. There's Duncan's van parked in the bus stop there. Now hold that image and I will show the wartime equivalent. I'm just keying it up for you. Hang on, got to get to it. It's really difficult to find. They list the photos in the Zoom out of order, but I'm getting to it now. I hope there we go. Here we go now. And that's the first Panther, Mike. Explain about the hole in the back of the tank there for us, please.
Yeah, it's quite likely that hole in the back of the turret was caused by the other Panther that was firing like a child in a tantrum that hit his own tank and set him on fire. You can see that the church tower has been mostly knocked down during the course of the fighting. Both sides tended to target church towers because they were a great place for snipers and foos to hide out. So everybody had a tendency to knock down the church towers to make sure that they weren't used against them.
I'll just show which map is the one that shows this action. Is it 8?
It is map 7 that shows
map
this.
7. So for those who just need a bit of a orientation, this is the map that shows. So the Brettville law goes towards the middle of the screen there. Roe is the town to the east where the SS kind of began their attack. And although it's the Le Bourg of Roe rather than the actual village itself, there's 2 parts of the village. And you'll see the arrows there indicating this attack that was happening almost 76 years ago to the minute that we're doing this program.
There's another short passage from the War Diary, the Reginas, that I think is worth reading because it talks about the arrogance of the Germans in their attack. And it starts by saying at 12:30 a.m., so we're on the morning of the 9th now, battalion headquarters, and I'm not sure if you have that photo of the fighting around the battalion headquarters, but the battalion headquarters was seriously shelled. Its vehicles were targeted and set on fire and left burned out. And it's quite clear there was quite a nasty fight around the battalion headquarters, which is usually not in the middle of the fighting. But it says the battalion headquarters was shelled and machine gunned when the enemy put a tank and infantry attack on the town. One Panther tank pulled up outside the battalion headquarters, and the commander jumped down and demanded that we surrender, and was met with a suitable reply, a Piat bomb. The tank was then knocked out by another Piat, and meanwhile, a hot time was had by all as the enemy tanks were all about the town, blasting away at men in their slit trenches and destroying one of our anti-tank guns. The whole sky was lit up by blazing roofs and burning tanks, as well as our own parachute flares. 5 Panther tanks were bagged in the vicinity of the battalion headquarters. At 04:23, Panther tanks left the vicinity of the battalion headquarters and RV'd a short distance away. Altogether, a hectic night was spent by all. A bright new page was written in the records of this battalion. Everyone fought magnificently, and although the picture looked black, there was no sign of wavering anywhere.
That was a fantastic account. Thanks for reading that, Mike. And I think it's also important to reference that this was also quite a psychological boost for the Allied army as well, because we'd come out of North Africa and perhaps Sicily thinking that the German armor was invincible and you need to be knocked out with armored vehicles. Well, here's proof you can knock these beasts out with Piats. And Fred was telling me in a great amazing account this afternoon that they actually strung Hawkins mines across the road on a string with a Hawkins mine every couple of feet, and that could have also contributed to the first Panther. And there's a half track that was also destroyed, which kind of overtook the first Panther was hit. I haven't actually got that photo with me because it's not a very good quality one, the one I have. And it shows you, as Mike said, the Panther in the rear putting a shell in the Panther in front, whether it was out of panic, whether he was bore sighting it, trying to get to the Piat position. We're not quite sure what was going on. But as I said earlier on, sometimes the SS could crumble quite quickly when things go badly for them. And extraordinary stuff we're doing now. So that is one of my little favorite stops on my Normandy tours. I like taking people here. I always get a bit of a kick when I bring out these incredible photos that were mostly taken, it has to be said, 2 or 3 days after the events. You'll see Canadian trucks and even British military police and things like that in them. And there's lots of photos of Brettville loggers. That's the headquarters to the left there with the railings that Mike was referencing. You know, the fighting is right in these buildings here. So I'm going to cut to back to Mag and Fred now, because they should be back in Puto. Have we covered this battle now? We've still got one more battle to come, by the way, folks.
Still
Don't
one
be
more
giving up on us
important
yet.
engagement, yeah.
So we're going to thank you, Duncan. I think, Duncan, you can move on to your final location on the south of the railway line. That was some amazing imagery there. Thank you so much, my friend. I'll cut to Mag and I'll let Mike do some summing up. So we're back to Mag and I'll put Mag's microphone on. Can we have Fred tell us a little bit about these? Well, Mike, do you want to sum up anything about the battles there before we bring to Fred?
No, let's go to Fred and he can talk about what's the place where he is right now.
So Fred, we're over to you to explain where we are and what about these monuments. So don't forget, we're back to Puto and Bessan now. So we're back to the first battle.
So we are standing on the church square. Those 2 black plaques, we paid them with our association, and I found the name of all the Canadian who were killed in action. So we have the Winnipeg Rifles on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side you have the Canadian Scottish 3rd Anti-Tank, 12th Field Artillery Regiment, 13th Field Artillery Regiment, and 62nd, which is the anti-tank unit of the 1st British Corps, and other units Mike already mentioned. So as you can see, that's the Canadian Scottish, and if you see the block numbers, what we call the block numbers is the serial numbers of the soldiers. The case for the British Columbia, So you can see that those numbers are very close, which means they all joined together, and they were killed in Puto. So they lost, the battalion lost the soldiers, but I mean by that it's they were brothers or brother-in-arms on the first place, but they were brothers as well, real ones, cousins. They knew each other for because they grew up in the same area mainly, and that's the same thing for the Winnipeg Rifles. You have many brothers and cousins who were killed in action there. So when they lost, that's the first casualties of the campaign. So they lost, many soldiers, and they were very impacted by the fact they were losing good friends, which they've been trained with for 4 years. And so the Canadian took it very badly on the first place, and then the replacement came, and it was also another difficulty because you have to recreate all the automatism inside the battalion or inside the units, and that wasn't a major difficulty to have new officer or new NCOs. So those plaques are made for people to remember the massive toll Canadian paid in Puto and the area of Puto, and those plaques for the Winnipeg Rifles. It includes the fact some of them were murdered as prisoner of war by the 12 SS Panther in Audrieu, Fontenay-le-Penel, and a few other places all around, in Brettville as well for the Regina Rifle. And some of them were killed as well as prisoner of war by accident when they were drafted in prisoner camps. Some American planes came and shot on the column, and 15 Canadian were killed. So it had to, they were not killed in Puto, but we decided to put names to remember them because they were taken prisoner here and they were killed by accident a few days after. So for example, you can see the Mikin brothers who were killed in as prisoner of war in Audrieu. You have the White brothers. You have the Chartrand's brother. And as already told you, you can see the block numbers and the serial numbers. And we have, as Mike already said, we have 205 names of soldiers who were killed in action in this area in Puto.
Thank you, Fred. And Mag, can you focus on did you get my message there on the left there, the C's? Can you focus on the C names on the left of that monument there, Mag? Because Mike wants to tell us about one of the men there. So down a bit, there we go. So Mike.
Yeah, I just want to mention Bill Cybulski. His name's actually spelt wrong there. It should be Cybulski. And he was a soldier in C Company of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. And his nephew, Pat Weston, is watching our show today. So just wanted to make sure that got put up for him.
Fantastic stuff. And thanks for watching us. And for those who are perhaps less familiar with the Canadian battles, and I'm not talking about Mike and Fred there, they know about these battles intimately, but I know there's people watching like Nick Short and Martin's watching and others, Sean are watching. If you don't get to the Canadian battlefields, you're missing out because there's some extraordinary tales of heroism there. And just look at the number of names on that monument there. This is from, don't forget, 1 battalion over the course of really just a few days. It's terrible losses. And the work of people like Mike Bechtold and Mark Zelke and Marc Milner and the guides here. There's Eric Leboeuf, is a guide, a Canadian guide living in Normandy. He does good work telling about the Canadians. And Fred has been involved in setting up these plaques here, and extraordinary stuff. And we're going to cut soon to Duncan again for our final battle, because Kurt Meyer, when his men came limping back from Brettville, Lorgueille's 2 or 3 hours on from where we are 76 years ago, he was determined to crush the Regina Rifles in Brettville, Lorgueille's, and mounted another attack the next morning, which Mike will tell us about, again, on location. So thank you, Mag. Thank you, Fred. That's incredible stuff. I may come back to you later on, and maybe to Fred for some final comments. But you've been brilliant, Fred. And don't forget, I will mention your book. I'll cut to Duncan now, and we'll bring Duncan into the story. And so Duncan is now facing north south of the railway line. I'll pull up that map. Is this map 7 again, Mike, or map 8 now?
We're on to map 8 now.
So map 8 is here. So I'll leave it on the screen for a bit here. So you can see there the blue, they've decided to go south from Rowe this time. And I'll let Mike talk a minute, and then use the railway line, which is on the embankment. See there, La Villeneuve, and then move in and attack Norrie, and then move into Brettville and Norrie from the south. And you'll see the red circle there around Norrie on Bessel. Well, that's where Duncan is. Duncan is about on that red dotted line there. And I'll hand over to Mike to tell us this incredible story.
Yeah, so Kurt Meyer hadn't learned his lesson yet. He was still determined to push the Reginas out of Brettville. He was still determined to use his Panther tanks to push them out. 1st and 4th companies had received a beating the night before. Now he was using the 3rd company of 12th SS Panzer Regiment. He'd looked at the battlefield, he'd surveyed it, and he thought that the key to unlocking the Canadian defenses was the little village of Norrie-en-Besson, where C Company under Major Stu Tubb was holding out. And so he planned to attack it with a direct armored assault of the Panthers, supported by an infantry attack coming from the south out of Saint-Mandeville, 1st Battalion of the 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment. So starting at about 12:30, just after lunch on the 9th of June, he sent his Panthers south from Rowe. They crossed the Cambayeux Highway. They went underneath the railway bridge, underneath the railway between Caen and Bayeux, and made a sharp turn to the right, to the west, and sorted themselves out for a direct attack on Norrie-en-Besson. They were making good time across country. They had infantry with them, which were stripped by Canadian artillery soon after they started. And they had just made a slight turn to the left, away from the railway line, towards Norrie-en-Besson. They thought all was good. Nobody seemed to be shooting at them from Norrie. And they were looking forward to breaking into the Canadian positions when their world exploded. All of a sudden, one of the Panther tanks blew up. Its commander thought that he'd run over a mine, and he looked around and he saw other tanks brewing up around him. And he at first couldn't understand what was happening, what was doing this to his powerful Panther tanks. Turns out that a part of a squadron of tanks from the 1st Hussars were just in the process of moving from Brettville to Norrie to reinforce the position there. And at the time of the German attack, they had found themselves in a little bit of dead ground just south of Brettville. And when you're standing on the highway between, or the old highway between Brettville and La Villeneuve, it's very clear that there's a slight rise that goes, as you leave Brettville, you go up the hill, and then you go down again into La Villeneuve. And the position where the Canadian tanks were in was hidden from view for the Panthers, but just as they made that half left turn, they exposed themselves, their soft side armor, to to the Sherman tanks. And there was, I'm not sure how many tanks, but certainly 4 and maybe 8 Canadian Shermans. At least one of them was a Firefly, the tank commanded by Lieutenant Geordie Henry. And they had their dream target. They had 11 or 12 Panther tanks sideways to them at less than 1,000 yards, and they were not seen, and they started firing away. So Henry made no mistake. His first shot hit a Panther tank, knocked it out. He soon fired 4 more shots, and 3 of those 4 shots brewed up more Panther tanks. Captain Tweedale, who was another tank commander, I'm not sure if he was in a Firefly that had the 17-pounder or if he was in a regular one. I think it was a Firefly. Accounted for 2 more Panthers, so that in something less than 4 minutes, 7 Panther tanks had been destroyed, and the other 4 had turned and had to run, couldn't do anything. Paul's showing you the pictures of these Panther tanks that were taken after the battle. Note that these Panthers weren't destroyed quite as badly as this by the shots fired on the 9th of June. They became something of a target range after the battle, and as Canadian and British units went through the area, they like to test their guns on these Panthers. So the photos we have of them from later in June or July show them quite riddled. Not most of that is the battle damage. He'd also put up an air photograph that was taken after the battle, and you can see on it the little dots of where those Panther tanks ended up. And to me, it's quite a remarkable find. So in there, you can see just across the top of the photo is the straight line. That's the railway line. And in the middle of the photo, just south of it, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little dots. They look like little hay mounds or something like that. And those are the Panther tanks that were knocked out by Lieutenant Henry and Captain Tweedale. Quite remarkable that that number of Panther tanks fell that quickly to Sherman tanks of the 1st Hussars. And what's really remarkable is that nobody knows who Lieutenant Henry is. It's a name that is probably new to most of you watching today. And in fact, until quite recently, I'd never even seen a photograph of this man. Last summer, I put out a call to some Canadian media types. I'd given a talk about this to them, and I said, if any of you have any sources that can try to find a picture of Lieutenant Henry, I'd love to see it, because I've never found one in all the years I've been looking at this. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, somebody came back to me and had found a picture of him that was published in a Montreal newspaper in this later in the summer, and we were finally able to put a face to the name. But quite remarkably, this guy isn't celebrated. I mean, what he did here, knocking out 5 Panther tanks in the space of 3 or 4 minutes, should have got him probably a Victoria Cross. It's one of the most amazing feats that was accomplished in Normandy. But not only did he not get a Victoria Cross, he wasn't awarded any kind of medal for it, because the commander of 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade thought that he was just doing his job. His job was to fight German Panthers and knock them out, and all he did was his job. So he wasn't going to give him a medal for doing anything he wasn't supposed to do anyway. So quite an interesting tale.
So, and I want to just confirm again this fact that these Panthers they knocked out that day and the day before, they can't be replaced. The 12th SS is hemorrhaging vehicles and hemorrhaging crews. They simply cannot replace. And the fact that we have Sherman tanks rolling off the production line, we can, as tragic as it is for the crews, we can replace the material pretty easily. We've got shells coming through, we've got the artillery coming through, we've got support from the Navy, we've got the 2nd Tactical Air Force, and that's another specialist subject of Mike is the air power up there, which is incredibly important. We've got air superiority, if not almost complete supremacy at this point. So to explain what's going on, Duncan is taking us to a final monument in the town of Brettville, Lourdes. We've still got Fred and Mag in Puto and Brettville. I'm just going to hand it back to Fred to see if he's got any final words he wants to say. But fairly shortly, we're going to bring this show to a bit of a halt. I'll just put it back on. Hang on Fred there. So, Fred, have you got any final words you'd like to say about these actions?
Actually, first I want to thank you. I want to thank Mike, because when I was younger, I grew up reading Mike's work. So that was very, I was very pleased and very honored to be involved in that life. So that's why I wanted to thank you. And secondly, to finish, it's I mean, I wrote my book because I wanted to pay a massive tribute for the Canadian, the Winnipeg, Reggianas, and the Canadian Scottish, because I grew up reading their stories in books, published in French or English, and I mean those plaques or the books, Marc Milner as well, Mark Zulke, Terry Copp, they wrote books, and I grew up with. So I wanted to be the French counterpart, and because I grew up there, I knew many French people who were there. We are now dead, and they passed away. So I'm very happy to let the people know what Canadian did in Normandy, especially in this area, because most of the time people are focused on the Ardennes Abbey, which is very important as well. But I think I wanted Puto and Brettville in a row to be put on relief to be on the on highlights, because the Canadian who died there or were wounded in action or they lost friends, they deserve their tribute as well.
Well, thank you very much, Fred. And for those watching, Fred is always worried that his English isn't perfect, but it's way better than my French. And Fred, I think, is a fantastic historian, a fantastic author. His new book, I'll just share the image of that. As I showed you the image of his Hold the Oak Line. His new book is going to be about the 49th Division and the 8th British Brigade. It will is only available in French, unfortunately, although he is going to have it translated. But even for the photos and the maps, and he has got, you know, shed loads of relics and his friends. So these are farmers who've pulled out bullets and mess tins and badges. And even if you can't read it fully, you'll appreciate it just for the imagery, which is incredible. And Mike is, I'm sure, nodding away at this. People like Terry Kopp, who Mike knows very well, and I don't think Mike would mind me saying that he's of a generation like I am, up from Fred. We need people like Fred to take the history on. Mike, Terry Kopp, they began the groundwork of this. Well, in fact, there was other historians before them, and now Fred will be the next generation taking it forward. Then someone else will come to replace Fred. But we're going to cut. Duncan is at the other morning. Thank you very much, Frederick. Thank you very much, Mag.
Yeah, thanks.
You've been brilliant. It's been fantastic. People are enjoying this a lot. People are saying thank you very much. I'm going to cut to Duncan now, who is now moved to back into Brettville Laureers. So Duncan is at the Regina Rifles Monument. And one of the things I always point out when I'm on tour here is the Regina Rifles acquired Brettville Laureers as a battle honor. This is why the officially recognized battle honors that a regiment will be given. Now, often a battle honor will just say something like Normandy landings or the crossing of the Orne, but the Regina Rifles did such an amazing job here. They had the little, and it's comparatively a small town, Brettville Laureers, listed as a battle honor. And Mike, obviously being the Canadian, if you want to add any details about the Regina Rifles, their nickname was the Johns. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, coming from Farmer John's.
Farmer John. I always wondered where it came from. And so they earned this town as a battle honor. And again, we can thank Duncan for doing the camera work here today. Thank you, Duncan. Put your thumb up in front of the camera if you hear us. Brilliant. And we're going to use Duncan again later on, because Duncan is very knowledgeable about the Guards Armor Division. He was in the Scots Guards in his career and lives in Normandy like I do. He's also offering tours, and I'll put your link to his website. And the Regina Rifles Monument. So that's Brettville. Don't forget in French there. And there's the wreath would have been laid either today or yesterday by the French. I was saying on June the 6th on the long broadcast, don't be thinking that the French have forgotten about the anniversary. Yes, the events are not attended by many of the public, but they are still happening and they are still taking place. And look at the size of that monument as well for a comparatively small town. I actually like Brettville Laureers. It's very, very, very pretty on the road between Bayeux and Caen. So I'm going to put it back to gallery view there because Mag and Fred are driving back. You can see the sun is beginning to kind of lower in the sky now. That's why we started this stream a little bit earlier than the events would actually have taken place, so that we get good coverage for what we've been doing today. And if you've got any other closing, I'll flash up a couple of Mike's books on screen, because you can find Mike's work as well. This is one he wrote with, or he's contributed to his essays in honor of Terry Kopp. He's prolific in terms of writing. He lectures, he speaks about the Battle of Normandy, he speaks about the Air War, First World War, other campaigns, and get yourself copies of Mike's work there. That's one of his other books there, which I haven't got a copy of, in fact. So I can't review that one. Maybe one will find its way in the post to me. Who knows? You never know about the air power in the desert campaign. And sometimes it takes a Brit to get the Canadians to actually boast about their success somewhat, because the Canadians, I think, are a little bit reticent to say how well they kicked ass in Normandy. And from a Brit there, they absolutely supremely kicked some German ass in Normandy. And the 12th SS was not the force it was after these engagements against the 7th Brigade. And we mustn't forget that the other brigades, the 8th and the 9th, are also engaging Germans on these same days. And my closing remarks, and I'll hand over to Mike in a minute, are going to be that if we were to follow the campaign on over the next 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 weeks, you get success followed by draw, followed by defeat, followed by draw, followed by the success, as both sides are kind of jostling position as for position as the Allies are building up their airfields, they're building up their strength. A couple of days later, you have Le Mesnil-Patry, that I may or may not do a broadcast about that in a couple of days, a few days' time. That was another advance by the Queen's Own Rifles Acad or other units that didn't go very well. And you've got Brettville-Bocage, which we will be covering, that didn't go entirely our way, although not as badly as some historians say. And Mike, you know, I can only thank you so much for doing this. And people are watching this live, and I think a lot more watch it later on because it's an awkward time for some people. But sum up the events and actions of the 7th Brigade for us. This idea that they didn't do very well, I think you've resoundingly put to bed. So thank you very much. But if you've got any comments you'd like to make, that'll be fantastic.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to start by thanking everybody involved. Fred has been fantastic with his coverage, and I've always been an admirer of his work. His book is absolutely fantastic in the detail of stuff he's had. Duncan and Mag have provided great footage for us today, and Paul for organizing all this. It's been an absolutely exceptional broadcast. To sum up what happened to 7th Brigade, I like to repeat the words of Michael Reynolds, who's written extensively on the Germans in Normandy and elsewhere. And Reynolds is a Brit. I think he's a former general in the British Army, and he generally doesn't have very nice things to say about the fighting prowess of the British and the Canadians. But he calls the Regina Stand in Brettville and Norrie one of the finest small unit actions of the entire war. And I fully support that assessment. I also take your words, Paul, very closely in terms of saying that the Canadians don't like to toot our own horn, and that's absolutely true. For some reason, we like to celebrate our failures, Hong Kong and Dieppe, rather than our successes. You look at some of the documentaries that have been produced by the National Film Board or CBC, and you look at the Valor and the Horror, and they choose to do episodes on Normandy, which focuses on the Black Watch going up Verrières Ridge instead of success stories like 7th Brigade. I frequently said that if the battles around Puto, Norrie, and Brettville had been a British battlefield or an American battlefield, you would have seen Tom Hanks doing a movie about it, or book after book being written, songs, poems, everything like that, celebrating it, oodles of gongs, awards for the men involved. But because it was a Canadian battle, it's almost been forgotten. And it's thanks to people like Fred and others, Marc Milner, who've been telling the story, that it's somewhat of a known battle now, but still not known in the way that it should. It should be right up at the top of how we assess Allied performance in Normandy. And it says a lot about the abilities of the Canadians and the abilities of the Germans as well. I think in terms of 12th SS participation in this battle, it was ugly. It was disjointed. It was poorly focused. You can look at it from the tactical level, where the employment of the tanks and infantry was clumsy, to the higher levels of command, where you look at what Meyer and Max Wunsche and Witt, the divisional commander, were doing, and it was a really, really poorly coordinated battle. They launched small attack after small attack, which allowed the Canadians to focus and concentrate against each small attempt to attack the Canadian position, consolidate our artillery, put them on the front, defeat each German attack in detail, when they would have been smarter to wait a little bit and launch a major attack. And it would have had a much bigger difference on the Canadians. Imagine if the combined weight of 12th SS had been launched at the Canadians at the same time, instead of these piecemeal attacks going in one after the other. It would have been a very different thing to deal with, but they didn't do that. Whether that was because of poor leadership skills, because of overconfidence, because of all of the above, the Germans really didn't do very well in this battle. And I guess the other thing I'll say is that it really shows about the difficulty of attacking in Normandy. And it doesn't matter if you were British, American, Canadian, or German. When you attacked in Normandy, you're going to have trouble, because the defense is so much more powerful than the attacker can ever be. And so long as you're attacking prepared defenses, you're going to have a tough time. And I think it maybe says less about the Germans than it does about the rest of the Allies attacking, and the fact that the Allies were able to eventually punch through the German defenses, whether it be along the Bocage, south of Caen, Operation Charnwood, Hill 112, any of those things. The fact was the Germans had all the advantages in terms of knowing the terrain, in terms of being dug in, of having strong armored forces and anti-tank forces and lots of artillery and machine guns and everything like that. And in spite of that, the Allies were able to break through. So I think that that's an important contrast to make between what's going on here.
Yeah, and of course the Allies do have to make the attacks. We have to get the ground covered. We do have to push the Germans back and over. This is still early in the campaign, 8th, 9th, and June. Both sides are still finding their feet. They're still getting used to just being in combat. But as the weeks pass, we start to learn that we do a smallish attack forwards. The Germans maybe hold us a bit, push us back a bit, but then they will counterattack. And if they counterattack, and James Holland always makes this point, they're almost Pavlovianly responses to counterattack, and then they can run into our anti-tank guns and our self-propelled guns, and we start learning how to draw them out. You have to get them to come out, so you have to push on a little bit, but then when they push out, then we push back again with more force, and we gradually learn how to push the Germans back, and all the time they're holding. And if for any Americans watching this, it is not about counting scores here, but for every German tank there is in the American sector in July, there's about 8 in the Canadian and British sector. And the Americans who are having their own problems with the Bocage and inland towards Saint-Lô, they're not really coming up against any German-made tanks for several weeks. It's Marders and self-propelled guns. The Canadians are up against the 12th SS from within really a few hours of invasion. The British are up against 21st Panzer Lehr get involved very early on. And where the Canadians aren't very good at pushing themselves, the British have been for many years criticized for this holding job around Caen and being very slow and not breaking out. Well, we may not be breaking out, but while we're not breaking out, we are destroying the German army that's running headlong into our forces on a daily basis. So we're going to come back and cover other events later on. Mike referenced Verrières Ridge and the Black Watch. We're going to bring David O'Keefe on to cover that in July and have that a story to explain to us. I have a particular fondness for Canadian battles. I'm going to bring us back to Saint-Lambert-Cedive and the battles for the Falaise Gap in August. So keep on watching. And it's a good point of the show to point out, please subscribe to World War II TV so you get updates what we're doing next. If you consider being a patron, that would help me out a little bit with the funds for the camera. I've got a new webcam today, another 280 euros I spent on a slightly better camera so you can see my ugliness and slightly better resolution. And but I'm going to bring it to an end very, very shortly. Again, heartfelt thanks to Mike for joining us and talking. And the pressure of doing this live is kind of fun, but it is, I get my words a bit mixed up and trying to coordinate and spin all these different plates and camera angles and sending messages to Mag and Duncan because they can't hear very well what I'm saying with the wind. And Mike saying, can you show that map? Can you show this map? And anyway, we've got there. It's been done. I didn't think we'd quite do an hour and 45 minutes, but it's been hopefully interesting. And I'm going to sign us out soon. And you can watch this on catch up on YouTube. So again, thank you, Mike. You won't have seen the last of Mike, I don't think. The more he wants to come back, I'd be welcome to have him. I know you like listening to him. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Mag. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Valerie, for driving, Duncan. And we'll see you all again on World War II TV soon.